The morning sun painted the Texas plains gold as Sarah Beth Morrison adjusted her white wedding dress one final time. Her hands trembled as she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of the small frontier church. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, marrying Thomas Whitfield, the banker's son from town. But something deep in her heart felt wrong. The church bells rang, signaling it was time. Sarah Beth's father knocked on the door, his voice gruff but gentle. "Time to go, daughter. Thomas is waiting." She nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. As she walked down the aisle, every step felt heavier than the last. The faces of the townspeople blurred together as she focused on Thomas standing at the altar, his smile confident and possessive. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Sarah Beth's heart pounded so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. No one spoke, but in that moment of silence, she realized she couldn't go through with it. Thomas wasn't cruel, but he had already made it clear that once married, she would be expected to be the perfect wife, silent, obedient, and grateful for his provision. As the preacher began the final vows, Sarah Beth's courage finally broke free. "I can't," she whispered, then louder, "I can't do this." The church erupted in gasps and murmurs. Thomas's face turned red with embarrassment and anger. "Sarah Beth, what are you doing?" he hissed through gritted teeth. Without another word, she gathered her skirts and ran. The heavy church doors slammed behind her as she fled into the bright morning light. Her white dress billowed like wings as she ran toward the horse and wagon that had brought her to the church. Behind her, she could hear Thomas shouting her name and her father's heavy footsteps on the church steps. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her hands shaking as she grabbed the reins. The old mare, sensing her urgency, began to move before Sarah Beth even gave the command. As they pulled away from the church, she looked back once to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. Her father stood beside him, shaking his head in disappointment. The wagon wheels turned faster as Sarah Beth urged the horse forward. She had no plan, no destination in mind except away. The wind caught her veil and tore it from her head, sending it floating back toward the town like a white flag of surrender. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief. As the church bells faded behind her and the endless Texas prairie stretched ahead, Sarah Beth felt both terrified and exhilarated. She had just thrown away everything that was expected of her: security, respectability, her family's approval. But she had also chosen freedom, even though she had no idea what that freedom would cost her. The sun climbed higher as Sarah Beth drove the wagon across the rolling grasslands. What had started as an escape was quickly becoming a nightmare. She had grown up in town, spending her days learning to embroider and play piano, not navigating the wilderness. The dirt road she had been following gradually disappeared, leaving only animal trails that led in confusing directions. The old mare began to slow, her sides heaving from the long run. Sarah Beth realized she had been pushing the poor animal too hard in her panic to get away. She pulled the reins gently, bringing the wagon to a stop near a small cluster of oak trees. The silence of the prairie was overwhelming after the noise and bustle of town life. As she climbed down from the wagon to let the horse rest, Sarah Beth became aware of how impractical her wedding dress was for traveling. The long train caught on everything, and the tight corset made it difficult to breathe in the growing heat. She had no food, no water, and no idea which direction would lead her to safety. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She had run away from her wedding, but she hadn't thought about what came next. Where could she go? She had no money of her own, no relatives who would take her in after such a scandalous act. The other towns were days away, and she didn't even know which direction to travel. Hours passed as she sat in the shade trying to think of a plan. The horse grazed peacefully, but Sarah Beth could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind picked up, making her heavy skirts whip around her legs. She climbed back onto the wagon and tried to continue, but she was completely lost now. As the afternoon wore on, the storm moved closer. The first drops of rain were cold against her skin, and soon the drops became a downpour. The dirt beneath the wagon wheels turned to mud, making travel difficult and dangerous. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, and thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. Sarah Beth had never felt so alone or frightened in her life. The wagon offered little protection from the storm, and she was soaked through within minutes. Her carefully arranged hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her white dress was now stained with mud and grass. Through the rain, she thought she saw smoke rising in the distance. It could be a farmhouse or a town, but it could also be something more dangerous. She had heard stories about outlaws and hostile tribes in this part of Texas, but she was too cold and scared to care about the risk. Any shelter was better than staying exposed to the storm. As she urged the tired horse toward the smoke, Sarah Beth wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Running from the church had felt like the right choice, but now she was lost, alone, and completely vulnerable. The storm seemed to be nature's way of telling her she should have stayed and accepted her fate as Thomas's wife. The smoke Sarah Beth had seen wasn't coming from a farmhouse or friendly settlement. As she drew closer through the driving rain, she realized her mistake. A group of rough-looking men had made camp in a grove of trees, and their eyes followed her wagon with predatory interest. These weren't honest travelers. Their clothes were dirty and torn, their faces hard and mean. Well, what do we have here?" called out one of the men, a tall fellow with a scraggly beard and cold eyes. He stood up from where he had been sitting by the fire, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Looks like a little lost bird flew right into our nest." Sarah Beth's heart pounded as she realized the danger she was in. She tried to turn the wagon around, but the other men had already moved to surround her. There were 5 of them, and they all looked like the kind of men her father had warned her about, outlaws who lived outside the law and took what they wanted. "Now don't be in such a hurry to leave, miss," said another man, shorter but with mean scars across his face. "We don't get much company out here, especially not pretty young ladies in wedding dresses. Looks like you had yourself a special day." "Please," Sarah Beth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to get to town. I'll leave you alone if you let me pass." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to cover herself, but the wet fabric offered little protection from their stares. The bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that made Sarah Beth's skin crawl. "I don't think so, sweetheart. You see, we've been on the trail for weeks now, and we're in need of some entertainment. A runaway bride is just what we've been hoping for." One of the men grabbed the horse's bridle, stopping any chance of escape. Another began to climb up onto the wagon. Sarah Beth scrambled backward, her hands shaking with terror. These men had no intention of letting her go, and she was completely helpless against them. "Stay back," she cried, but her voice broke with fear. The men only laughed harder at her distress. The storm continued to rage around them, the thunder drowning out any sounds that might bring help. Not that there was anyone around to help her anyway. Just as the scarred man reached for her, a new sound cut through the storm, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. The outlaws looked up in surprise and alarm. Through the rain came a lone rider on a powerful horse, moving with the skill and grace of someone born to the saddle. The rider was a Comanche warrior, his long black hair streaming behind him as he rode. His face was painted for war, and he carried a lance that gleamed even in the dim light of the storm. The outlaws immediately reached for their guns, but the warrior was already among them, his horse wheeling and turning with incredible speed. Sarah Beth watched in amazement and terror as the warrior fought the 5 outlaws. His movements were fluid and deadly, and within moments 3 of the men were on the ground. The remaining 2 turned and ran into the storm, apparently deciding that whatever they might have gained wasn't worth facing this fierce opponent. The warrior sat on his horse in the rain, looking down at Sarah Beth with dark, unreadable eyes. She didn't know if she had been rescued or if she was now in even greater danger. Sarah Beth pressed herself against the back of the wagon seat, her whole body trembling from cold and fear. The Comanche warrior sat motionless on his horse, studying her with eyes as dark as midnight. She had heard terrible stories about what happened to white women who fell into the hands of Indian warriors. Her mind raced with all the frightening tales her neighbors whispered about raids and captives. The warrior was younger than she had first thought, perhaps near her own age of 20. His face was strong and proud, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Rain dripped from his black hair, which was decorated with feathers and beads. Despite her fear, Sarah Beth couldn't help but notice that there was something noble about his bearing, something that set him apart from the crude outlaws he had just defeated. Slowly, the warrior dismounted from his horse. Sarah Beth shrank back further, expecting him to grab her or tie her up like a captive. Instead, he approached the wagon with his hands visible and empty of weapons. When he spoke, his English was clear and careful, though accented with the musical tones of his native language. "You are hurt?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. His eyes moved over her torn dress and the cuts on her hands from the brambles she had pushed through during her escape. There was concern in his expression, not the cruelty she had expected. Sarah Beth couldn't find her voice at first. She simply stared at him, waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. When she finally managed to speak, her words came out in a terrified rush. "Please don't hurt me. I know you probably hate white people and I understand why, but I never did anything bad to your people. I'm just lost and scared." The warrior tilted his head slightly as if puzzled by her words. "Why would I hurt you? Those men were going to harm you. I stopped them." He gestured toward where the outlaws had fled. "I'm called Running Bear. What is your name?" "Sarah Beth," she whispered, still not trusting this unexpected kindness. "Sarah Beth Morrison." She paused, then added, "Well, I was supposed to be Sarah Beth Whitfield today, but I ran away from my wedding." A small smile crossed Running Bear's face, transforming his stern features. "Ah, that explains the white dress and why you are alone on the prairie during a storm. You chose freedom over a marriage you did not want." Something in his tone made Sarah Beth look at him more carefully. There was understanding in his voice, not judgment. She had expected mockery or threats, but instead found what seemed like respect for her choice. "You don't think I'm foolish?" she asked. "I think you are brave," Running Bear replied simply. "It takes courage to choose your own path even when it is dangerous." He glanced up at the dark sky where lightning still flashed. "But you cannot stay here in this storm. You will become sick and there may be more bad men in this area." Sarah Beth looked around at the desolate prairie, finally understanding how desperate her situation truly was. She had no shelter, no food, and no idea how to survive in the wilderness. The storm showed no signs of stopping and night would fall soon. She was completely dependent on the kindness of this warrior who had appeared like something out of a legend. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice small and lost. "I can't go back to town after what I did, but I don't know how to live out here." Running Bear moved closer to the wagon, and Sarah Beth noticed that despite his fearsome appearance, his movements were careful and non-threatening. "You are safe here with me," he said quietly. "I will not let harm come to you. My village is not far. You can shelter there until the storm passes and you decide what you want to do." For the first time since fleeing the church, Sarah Beth felt a spark of hope. This warrior, whom she had been taught to fear, was offering her protection and shelter when her own people had driven her away. Running Bear helped Sarah Beth climb down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful as he assisted her. The storm was growing worse and standing water was beginning to collect in the low areas of the prairie. He quickly unhitched her tired horse and tied it to a lead rope behind his own mount. "We must leave the wagon," he explained, as he gathered some supplies from the wagon bed. "My horse can carry us both, but the wagon will only slow us down in this mud." Sarah Beth nodded, though the idea of leaving behind her last connection to her old life felt frightening. Running Bear removed his buffalo hide cloak and wrapped it around Sarah Beth's shoulders. The hide was warm and dry underneath, and it smelled of wood smoke and prairie grass. "This will keep the rain off, Lao," he said, then lifted her easily onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode through the storm, Sarah Beth was amazed by Running Bear's skill. He seemed to know exactly where he was going despite the poor visibility, and his horse moved confidently across terrain that would have been treacherous for her wagon. She felt safer than she had all day, wrapped in the warm cloak with the steady presence of the warrior behind her. They rode for what felt like hours through the driving rain. Sarah Beth found herself relaxing against Running Bear's chest, lulled by the rhythmic movement of the horse and exhausted by the emotional trauma of the day. At some point she must have dozed because she woke to find that the storm had passed, and stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. "We are almost there," Running Bear said softly, and Sarah Beth could see the warm glow of fires ahead. As they approached, she realized they were entering a Comanche village, something she had never imagined she would see. The circular teepees were arranged in a wide circle, and smoke rose from cooking fires where families were preparing their evening meals. The arrival of Running Bear with a white woman caused quite a stir. People emerged from their homes to stare at the unusual sight. Children ran alongside the horse, chattering excitedly in their native language. Sarah Beth felt dozens of eyes on her, and she was grateful for the concealing buffalo cloak. Running Bear guided his horse to a teepee that was larger than the others, decorated with painted symbols that seemed to tell a story. An older woman emerged from inside, her face marked with the lines of many years but her eyes sharp and intelligent. She spoke rapidly to Running Bear in Comanche, her tone suggesting she was asking many questions. Running Bear replied in their language, and Sarah Beth caught her own name mentioned several times. The older woman studied Sarah Beth with curious but not unfriendly eyes, then nodded and gestured for them to come inside. "This is my grandmother, Singing Bird," Running Bear explained as he helped Sarah Beth down from the horse. "She says you are welcome in her lodge. She was once married to a white man, so she understands something of your people's ways." Inside the teepee it was warm and dry with a small fire burning in the center. Beautiful woven rugs covered the ground, and bundles of herbs hung from the poles, filling the air with a pleasant, earthy scent. Singing Bird bustled around preparing food and laying out dry blankets. "She says you must eat and rest," Running Bear translated as his grandmother pressed a bowl of warm stew into Sarah Beth's hands. "Tomorrow we can talk about what you want to do, but tonight you are safe." As Sarah Beth tasted the unfamiliar but delicious food, she realized that everything she had been taught about the Comanche people was wrong. These weren't the savage monsters her neighbors described, but ordinary people showing kindness to a stranger in need. She looked at Running Bear, who was watching her with gentle concern, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Sarah Beth woke to the sound of children laughing and the smell of cooking food. For a moment she was confused about where she was. Then she remembered everything. The wedding, her escape, the storm, and the warrior who had saved her. Singing Bird was already awake, tending the fire and preparing breakfast. The older woman smiled and offered Sarah Beth a cup of herbal tea that tasted of mint and honey. Running Bear appeared in the doorway of the teepee, carrying Sarah Beth's few belongings that he had saved from the wagon. Her wedding dress was ruined, but he had managed to rescue a small bag containing her mother's jewelry and a few personal items. "I thought you might want these," he said, setting them beside her. Over the next few days, Sarah Beth began to learn about life in the Comanche village. Singing Bird took her under her wing, teaching her practical skills that her fancy town upbringing had never included. She learned to cook over an open fire, to preserve meat by drying it in the sun, and to make tools from animal bones and stones. The other women in the village were initially curious but cautious about the white woman among them. However, Sarah Beth's willingness to work and learn gradually won their acceptance. She discovered that many of them had fascinating stories. Some had been captured from other tribes, others had married into the band, and a few had chosen to leave their own people to join the Comanche way of life. Running Bear taught her to ride in the Comanche style, showing her how to guide a horse with just her knees and how to shoot a bow from horseback. Sarah Beth had always been told that such things were impossible for women, but she found that with practice, she could do things she had never imagined. The physical activity made her feel strong and capable in ways that embroidery and piano lessons never had. In the evenings, the village would gather around the fires to share stories and music. Sarah Beth learned that Running Bear was not just any warrior, but the son of a respected chief. He was known for his courage in battle and his wisdom in council, despite his youth. She also learned that he had been married once before, to a woman who died in a raid by Mexican soldiers 2 years earlier. As the days passed, Sarah Beth found herself thinking less and less about her old life. The freedom to move and work and make her own choices was intoxicating. She no longer had to worry about sitting properly or speaking only when spoken to. Here her opinions were valued, and she was respected for her contributions to the community. Running Bear spent time with her each day, teaching her about Comanche customs and helping her understand the language. Their friendship deepened as they shared stories about their different worlds. Sarah Beth told him about life in town, with its rigid rules and expectations, while he described the traditional ways of his people and their connection to the land. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Running Bear asked her a question that she had been dreading. "The men from your town will come looking for you soon. They will want to take you back. What will you tell them?" Sarah Beth stared into the flames, knowing he was right. Thomas and her father would not simply let her disappear. They would organize a search party, and when they found her, they would expect her to return and accept her punishment for the scandal she had caused. The thought of going back to that life of restrictions and judgment made her feel sick. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly, but I don't know if I have a choice. They'll say I was kidnapped, that I'm not in my right mind. They won't believe that I chose to stay here." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, then he reached over and took her hand. "There is always a choice," he said. "The question is whether you are brave enough to make it." 3 weeks after Sarah Beth's arrival in the village, the sound of approaching horses brought everyone to alert. Running Bear climbed to a high point and confirmed what they all expected. A group of white men was riding toward the village under a flag of truce. Sarah Beth's heart pounded as she recognized Thomas Whitfield and her father among the riders, along with the town sheriff and several armed men. "They have come for you," Singing Bird said gently, placing a comforting hand on Sarah Beth's shoulder. "But the choice of what happens next is yours to make." Sarah Beth looked around at the village that had become her home, at the people who had accepted her and taught her to be strong. Then she looked at Running Bear, who stood ready to fight, for her if necessary, but whose eyes told her that he would respect whatever decision she made. "I know what I want," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I need to face them myself." As the townsmen approached, Sarah Beth walked out to meet them. She no longer wore her ruined wedding dress, but instead wore the practical, buckskin clothing that Singing Bird had made for her. Her skin was tanned from working outdoors, and her hair was braided in the Comanche style. She looked healthy and strong, very different from the frightened bride who had fled from the church. "Sarah Beth," her father called out, spurring his horse forward. "Thank God you're alive. We've come to take you home." Thomas rode up beside him, his face showing a mixture of relief and anger. "What have these savages done to you?" he demanded. "Look at you. They've turned you into one of them." "No one turned me into anything," Sarah Beth replied calmly. "I chose this life because it's better than the one you had planned for me." The sheriff, a practical man named Collins, looked around at the peaceful village scene. Children played nearby while women continued their daily work, paying little attention to the white visitors. It was not what he had expected to find. "Miss Morrison, these people haven't hurt you?" "Quite the opposite," Sarah Beth said. "They saved me from men who would have hurt me, and they've given me a home when my own people turned me away for following my heart." Her father's face grew red with embarrassment and anger. "Following your heart? You humiliated our family and broke your promise to Thomas. A woman doesn't just run away from her responsibilities." "A woman shouldn't be forced into marriage like a piece of property being sold," Sarah Beth shot back. "I tried to tell you I didn't want to marry Thomas, but no one would listen." Running Bear stepped forward, moving to stand beside Sarah Beth. His presence was calm but protective, and the mounted men tensed nervously. "She speaks the truth," he said in his careful English. "She came here of her own choice, and she stays of her own choice. We do not hold prisoners." Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, but Sheriff Collins quickly raised a hand to stop him. "Now hold on, everybody. Let's keep this peaceful." He looked at Sarah Beth with curious eyes. "Miss, are you saying you want to stay here with these Indians?" Sarah Beth felt Running Bear's steady presence beside her, and she thought of all the kindness and respect she had found in this place. "I'm saying I want to stay where I'm valued for who I am, not what someone else thinks I should be. I want to stay where I can make my own choices." She turned to look directly at Thomas, seeing him clearly for the first time. "You never loved me, Thomas. You loved the idea of having a proper wife to show off. And I never loved you either. We would have made each other miserable." After much heated discussion, Sheriff Collins finally declared that since Sarah Beth was over 18 and clearly had not been taken against her will, there was nothing legally they could do to force her to return. Her father disowned her on the spot, declaring that she was no daughter of his if she chose to live with savages. As the townsmen rode away, Sarah Beth felt both sadness and relief. She had lost her old family, but she had gained a new one. Running Bear took her hand as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. "Are you sorry?" he asked softly. Sarah Beth smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in her life. "No," she said. "I'm finally home." 6 months later, Sarah, Beth, and Running Bear were married in a ceremony that blended both Comanche and Christian traditions. She had found not just freedom, but love with a man who saw her as an equal partner. Her wedding dress this time was beautiful buckskin decorated with beads and feathers, and she had never been happier to say, "I do,"